we had just finished this project where we had figured out a way to mine data from Epic, and it was data that everybody in the world has, and everybody has the same problem, but we were somehow able to take that data and show us something we'd never seen before.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Jason Goodwin, president of Innovative Cultures, and this will be Jason's second appearance on the show. Last time, we kicked off a conversation around predictive analytics, but much more focused on staffing. Now we're going to be really looking into the future, and we're going to be talking about succession planning. And Melanie, with what we already know about a retiring workforce in nursing, that this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. And quite likely, if you're in management today, you're already dealing with some frustrations around this. And Jason, boy, does he have an algorithm for you to help you solve your problem and be much more proactive in addressing a major concern for healthcare organizations that's going to be there for the next decade.
Yeah, everything Jason has to say is really helpful, and coming at it with my own experience as a manager and the ways that I would go to leadership and ask for more staff or things that I needed. If I had had the algorithm that he had, if I had had the information that he shared, I really think I would have been more successful in the begging and pleading that I was doing, because I would have had the data that I needed to back up what I was asking for. So I really think he's just got a lot of good information to share with everybody that's listening today.
All right. Well, we're going to get into it after a short break with Jason Goodwin.
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Jason Goodwin, president of Innovative Cultures. And I'm not going to say this is a part two of an interview. I'm going to say it's a continuation of a conversation on a previous podcast. Last time we spoke to Jason, we talked about predictive analytics and perioperative staffing. But the next logical part of this conversation is succession planning. So Jason, thanks so much for coming on the show yet again. Welcome back.
Well, thank you all for having me back. It's great to continue this conversation.
So just in case nobody listened to the prior interview, and I'm going to encourage everyone to go back and look that episode up, but just in case, can you talk a little bit about your background and 20 years in this space?
Sure. Yeah, my background, I have about 20 years plus in procedural room nursing and management. And the beginning of my career started out in the military. I was deployed after some time in the medical hospital and Naval Hospital Camp Pendleton out to Iraq and Iraqi freedom in 2003. And I was deployed with the Marines during the incursion of Iraq. And we were attached to a surgical suite. So we were part of the Charlie surgical team. And we were out at the forward edge of battle receiving soldiers and enemy prisoners of war for repair for surgery. And so that was my first experience in a surgical area, and then got back about a year later and, begged, borrowed, and stole to stay in the procedural area since. So that's pretty much all I've done. And I started managing people over close to 20 years ago.
Wow, fantastic. And again, maybe we should talk a little bit about what we discussed on the first episode around staffing and predictive analytics. Maybe really succinctly to walk us into this kind of continuation of that conversation, a summary of predictive analytics and in staffing and some of the highlights of our first conversation.
So really this entire discussion is about how we used some predictive analytics to solve problems that we always had, we always ran up against as managers in perioperative departments. And it's really a double-sided coin. The succession planning is the whole kit and caboodle, but the beginning is how, if you're going to succession plan, you're going to develop your future hiring. That's more of a long-term strategy. What's your short-term strategy before you can get those people? Right. And so the first conversation was, how do we do the very best with what we already have? And how do we make them as effective as possible in the future so that we are good stewards of the resources that we have? We can help make the surgeons happy, and consequently, everybody seemed to have less banging their head against the wall as a result of it, using these tools that we were able to mine.
All right, so now we're going to put some statistics behind this, but at the same time, I don't think this is going to shock anybody out there listening to this episode around, the current statistics of nurses and nurse leaders that are, either retiring or already have retired or generally leaving the workforce. We've been told about this impending boom or baby boomer generation of nurses and nurse leaders that are going to be exiting the workforce, and that this shortage was coming. The pandemic really escalated that, I think, to some extent, and now here we kind of are. So do you have some statistics that you can really put some numbers to that for everybody to put it into context?
Sure. So I know that most people are aware of the fact that OR nursing, particularly listeners to this program, OR nursing staffing is getting more difficult. We have a high attrition rate as it is, and so does the rest of nursing for that fact. But I think what happened to all of nursing is we were already heading into a time where we knew the baby boomers were getting older. There has always been a little bit of a deficit in the ability for nursing schools to meet the needs of what hospitals have. And so although that has been well addressed over the last few years, what we saw 2 years ago was that in the operating room particularly is the job became hard for every nurse out there. OR nurses were asked when their surgeries were canceled to go work in other places that they didn't want to work. People that are going into nursing, some of them, I can tell you I teach nursing, and some of our classes are smaller than they've been in the past. And so all of this equals into a problem with having available nurses. And then also, it takes a long time to train an operating room nurse, right? And even with novice nurses in the operating room, what surgeons are really looking for is somebody that is highly proficient in more than one specialty, and that takes time to cultivate.
It does take time, and it takes a lot of years of experience. And then when you look at the aging workforce, statistically, so many more nurses are getting ready to retire or looking at retirement, and then throw the pandemic in there. And a lot of them said, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm just done. If we know that there's going to be vacancies, we know there's holes to fill, and it takes a lot of time to train to get those people that are proficient enough to be able to fill the gaps. How do we use those predictive analytics to be prepared so that we're not stuck with running around the OR with our hair on fire because we don't have the people that we need, and we're adequately preparing ahead of time to fill those gaps?
Sure. Well, Melanie, I think we didn't know, right? And so we were stuck running around the OR without the people that we needed, pointing the fingers at one another, trying to understand why we never could get somebody on board when we needed them, right? And so that's what we need. We needed data, and we forever were chasing it around. I remember seeing something, trying to figure out, and we've broken this problem down 100 different ways, right? We go to the hiring meetings and we talk with HR, and if there's any HR people on here, I'm going to tell you right now, if there's an antagonist in this story right now, I'm going to give you a little bit of trouble. But I remember reading that it takes 100 days to find an RN in the OR once the position is posted. And then if you run that through what the hiring, the offering process, the testing and employee health process, right? You're talking about 3 months to get somebody on board and then another 6 months to get them through training if you're lucky enough to have that ability, right? We would go into these meetings and I would say these things, and I'm quite positive that they were all thinking in their minds, you're such a complainer, I mean, you always tell us you don't have enough and things are so terrible, right? But at the end of the day, it's like I hear a lot of the other managers, but and then I would come out and say at some point, well, I'm trying to express why it's so important because after all, we are 60% of your operating expense, right? And so that's always a good thing to say, but maybe not for your colleagues, right? And so I needed a better way to argue that we were in trouble. And so we started looking at predictive analytics. And we had just finished this project where we had figured out a way to mine data from Epic, and it was data that everybody in the world has, and everybody has the same problem, but we were somehow able to take that data and show us something we'd never seen before. And so we're right in line with that. We started talking about how we would take the same mindset and say, where's the data that we can find for knowing when our staff is going to be needed, right? And so when you're a manager, you already know that you have your hiring plan, right? You have your position control report that says who's been hired, who's been fired, and what the process is. But that's all very reactive. So we took that and we said, okay, we have this and that's great. We know how long it takes to train somebody. And at that time, we had an OR training program, which was great, right? A lot of places didn't. And so had the ability to we'd put through 170 people in the last, it was, close to 20 years, but we were putting through, 3 to 5 people per class once a year. So we knew we were able to get those people into high quality training, but that wasn't going to be enough. We had pending problems. We had growth. We were at saturation for our operating room. We had building that wasn't going to happen for 3 to 4 years. We had patients, our waiting log was long. People needed surgery and they weren't able to get it, right? And so these are things we needed to be able to change. So we started saying, okay, we know we need more people in our training program, and we're starting to feel like there's waning support from our C-suite. So we started saying, okay, how can we get the data to show our C-suite where we are? We just can't put it into words. So we started talking with our HR, and we went to them and said, hey, HR guys, can we get information on the number of employees' ages? And they said, absolutely not. And we said, why not? We don't need anything except the ages. No, you can't do that. That's personal information. So we said, okay, well, we went back to the drawing board and came back the next day and said, how about if you guys de-identify all of our employees except for their ages, and you just give us that information? They said, let me talk to our boss. We'll get back to you. They came back and they said, it's fine. So we took that data out of every employee that we had. Now we know how old every one of our employees is. And we put that into a scatter plot, right? And so for those of you that don't like analytics, earmuffs, okay, because we're going to get a little technical here, but we put it in a scatter plot, right? And so now we have a general idea of where everybody is. And we took that and we grabbed some data that we did have, which is where are the ages, the years of service for every employee, right? Now that was de-identified also. We had to get that through HR. So now we have the number of people, and we have their ages. And then we also have the number of years that they've been serving, right? So by that, we were able to put on the x-axis one and the y-axis the other, and we were able to create these zones, okay? So if you think about a scatter plot with some zones drawn around it, we created a green, yellow, and red zone. And so the green zone were people, and this was 57 FTEs of ours, okay? We identified that 57 FTEs are presumably within 10 years of retiring based on their age and their years of service, right? So then we created a second that said 15 FTEs were within 5 years. And then we had 32 that were within 3 years. So here we know right now, okay, we know that we have all these things coming up. We have expansion coming. We also know that at a minimum, we're going to lose 32 FTEs in the next 3 years. And our current hiring rate was something less than 7 a year, right? So we knew we were in trouble. 60% of our RNs were in one of those 3 retirement zones. Yeah, basically at that point, we knew we had a burning platform, right? So yeah, the next point was putting this into something that we could present and argue to get an outcome that we were hoping for.
You just touched on something about how you worked with human resources, because a lot of times, and there's good reason there, but I've talked to a lot of leaders, not just in terms of succession planning, but just staffing and hiring and even, knowing when they've got a performance issue, how they get from point A to point B and start working on replacing, that position and an exit strategy for, the need for turnover in those scenarios. But I think you just touched on something that's really critical is, we really only need this to tell us what we need to know. So is there a way for you to still be within the confines of your responsibilities and protecting the employees' information, et cetera, and still allow us to achieve our goals? Do you have any other thoughts on working with human resources to piggyback off of that might still come into play, or how maybe the results of that and the predictive analytics can almost assist you in saying, hey, here's what we really need to show the organization, because guess who's really going to get beat up by this when we actually hit this point? It's going to be you as human resources. Where's the staff? Where's the staff? Where's the staff? So you're actually helping them do their job, right?
Yeah, JP, I don't have this in my discussion, but I do think that's a really great point, because one thing that did happen from this project is and this would be added to the outcomes that we talked about along with the C-suite understanding it, is that HR, once they realized the situation, they did start to work with us. I remember a discussion about, okay, let's go talk to the recruiters. Let's see how they're screening these candidates, and it turns out we were screening people too tightly. And so there were people that were never even getting a discussion that some of them we ended up hiring. So yeah, we had those conversations. We found ways to grease the wheels to speed up the hiring process. And at some point, that's something that is at the limitations of the system, but very often it's not, right? It's just a couple people talking to each other and conveying the urgency of the situation, which is really what all of this is about, isn't it?
So, Jason, it sounds like a wonderful process that you developed, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I guess my question would be, something like this is going to cost the hospital a lot of money in order to develop all those people. All that training is going to be pretty expensive. How were you able to convince the C-suite that it was a necessary expense and had to be worked into the budget?
Yeah, always with the money, Paul, with you,
Yeah, well, hey, the reason I say that is because I was a hospital administrator. I know where the pressure is, and that's one of the pressure points.
Yeah,
so,
you know where the bodies are buried, that's for sure. Yeah, so okay. Yes, you're right, Paul. There is an investment, and that's one of the issues. Is an OR training program is a very difficult thing to keep afloat, right? And it's because it takes a leap of faith from your administration to pay lots of money up front with no real concrete, tangible outcome except that the OR keeps running smoothly, right? And so you have to be able to, and I think that might be where the most valuable part of this discussion is being able to convey how important 3 years down the road is in your operating room. And so, Paul, you're right. What we were able to do is once we had that information and we knew we had, for instance, 32 FTEs is a pretty good number to be able to throw out there in an elevator, right, and get someone's attention. What we were able to do is we took that and we actually took the next 5 years and we projected out what it was as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, and I cut and pasted different rectangles in the sheet. I colored the rectangles. I typed in text on them that said, this is the OR training program. I created what was essentially a Microsoft project document, right? I said, okay, this is our OR training program for the next 6 months of 2015. And then at the end of that, we're going to have 2 people. And then right below that, this is our next OR training program. 6 months after that, in January 16, we're going to have 6 more people. And I parlayed that out for 3 to 5 years. And that gave us this running total of positive hiring, right? And then we just played out the number of people that we think we can hire and train during this time. And then we took, did you have a question, JB?
No, I just was going to emphasize the capacity piece, and putting that part into the planning, right? And making sure that everybody understands that there is a capacity element. You can only do so much at one time.
Yeah, right. So what is the most we can possibly bring into this organization right now, right? And you have to find that because you have to identify what your attrition is, and then the difference will be your argument, right? And so that's what we did. And I can tell you the amount that we can bring in through training and OR training program and hiring, it was much lower than what the need was going to be. That was obvious. So the second layer below that was our needs, right? And our attrition rate. And those are our losses. And so we laid that out. And that included things like our ongoing attrition rate over the last 5 years, which we could calculate based on the people that have left or have retired or quit. And that was about 7 FTEs a year. So every year we were losing 7 FTEs just based on natural attrition. We had an expansion program that was eventually going to be needed later down the road. And that essentially is a need, right? So that falls below attrition, but it's also an expansion. So the needs are increasing even over above what we normally do. And so long story short, we ended up realizing that we had a great OR training program with great retention and everything was going well with it, but we were worried about it losing support. And so what we found out when we crunched all the numbers, including what we were going to need, is that without our OR training program continuing, we were going to minus 10 FTEs in 2 years just based on that alone, right? And so we were able to take that data and say, and this was with 2 OR training programs per year. At the end of 2 years, we realized that with our current OR training program, we would be in the hole with everything that we're doing with hiring, with our OR training program, and everything else. We'd be 10 FTEs in the hole for what we needed within 2 years. And so we started rolling that into, and I had this graphic display, right, as I was saying, that I thought I could show to our C-suite to say, here's the timeline that I'm telling you about. Here are the things that are intervening, and here is the iceberg in the water, right? And so we started talking about that. And as we did that, we realized that we were in much bigger trouble than we thought. So in the 3 years, we had 19 FTEs that were going to be leaving just through natural attrition. We had 9 people. We were 9 people ahead of the curve at that time. And the expansion was going to require 20 more people. And so essentially what it came down to is that we were shocked to learn that we were going to need 50 FTEs over the next 3 years in order to keep ourselves where we needed to be.
Wow.
And so that was what we took into the C-suite to talk about what we needed. And it was going to be a big conversation.
Yeah. How was that received once you brought it in there? I mean, that's a logical next question. I mean, were they impressed? Did they require some convincing? Was it a little bit of a mix of both? Like, how did that go over?
Or smelling salts.
It went up like a lead balloon, I can tell you. But I went in, and obviously it wasn't what the room wanted to hear, right? But it wasn't the first time this is being conveyed. And the truth is that your leaders, it's constantly a struggle to give them the information in the way that they need it so that they can do something about it, right? But when you do, they want to help. That's my experience, right? And so what we were able to do is to say, hey, listen, COO, I know you have lots to think about right now, but what you should be thinking about is how your OR is going to run into the ground in 3 years if we don't do something today. And that's important, right? And so that's what we were able to show, and not just say, it's me, Chicken Little, the nurse director, saying that that's important, right? This is exactly what you're telling us that you want to do. This is what we need to do to run our OR. We have expansion coming. And not only do we need to continue our two times a year OR training program, we need to increase that. And so the long story short about that is when we actually had that discussion and we were able to give that information to our COO and realize that we needed 50 FTEs over 3 years. We previously had 12 slots per year that were going into this program, and that was in jeopardy of being cut in the budget season. And once the COO realized the urgency, we went from 12 endangered slots to 18 slots instead in 3 times a year. So we not only saved the program, but we increased the importance and the pipeline. And so I think what we were able to do with that is create a scenario to where we learn how to speak to our leaders.
I was just going to say, having been in the C-suite for a long time, that what you did was give the administrator the information needed to go up the chain. Because typically in many organizations, most hospitals now belong to a system. And even the CEO of a hospital doesn't always have the ability to make the decision on something like that. It's got to go up to the corporate ladder. They've got to release those funds and allow for that money to go down and trickle down to your department. So the better information that you can give to your administrator to provide for them so they can sell it up the chain, the better off you are as a hospital, as an OR leader. So what you did is the perfect scenario for helping your boss make that case.
Yeah, I don't know if this is common in other industries because I've never really worked in other industries, but in nursing management and hospitals maybe in general, it seems like we don't get a lot of practice or training in communicating, translating clinical needs into business needs. And so I think a lot of us get stuck with I told you what the problem is, and it seems like you're not helping. And I'm not amazing at this either. I mean, it's been a learning process, but I have learned the value of if you can just really hone in on distilling what that information is, then you will get a lot of support from your C-suite.
Now, you said you went from 12 to 18 in the program. I guess my follow-up question on that is, was that a stressor on, the people running the program and working with the group? Did you have to make some adjustments? Did you have the necessary experience in the department to deal with that increase? Did it require extra additional mentorship? How did that work out operationally?
Well, we never planned on it happening. So we never even asked the people that do the training if they would be able to expand. But once we came away with that answer, it was high class problems, right? We went out there and said, hey, listen, how are we going to figure out how to grow this program? And we did. And it did require some shifting around. The good part is, as related to our last conversation, because we had accomplished so much with our proficiency and our development process, and we had data, that made all of the training programs even better, right? So this data was able to really purify what was needed, tell us where our pieces were. And so it was we had more people available for things like mentorship and things like that. But we also, we got a little innovative. We went into the evenings. We did some Saturdays and Sundays. So yeah, we did whatever we needed to do. I mean, it was a big facility, so we had some resources.
I absolutely love the fact that you were very honest about, we went into this meeting not expecting to get what we wanted. And then we did. And, that's, again, we talked a little bit about the entrepreneurial spirit behind this on that first episode. And, even when we talked about just building, the interface to be able to take that data and do something with it, right? With the individual on your team who had that programming experience. But that's another thing that always happens. And we'll go back to Paul, who only cares about money. Just kidding. But if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a business, a lot of times what happens is you kind of have to go and make the sale, and you don't necessarily know how you're going to deliver on the sale. Like, you've got a plan, you've got an idea, you've got a vision, but until you have the money, you can't prepare for all of that, because it's just not a reality, and it can't fund itself until you do the first part. So then all of a sudden you go from, whew, we finally got what we wanted, but now we have to figure out how to actually do it. And so it does take that kind of bold willingness to go sell something because it's the right thing to do. And then because I am sure that the C-suite also saw passion, because they had to believe that if you were saying that this needed to be done and you had the data to back it up, that somebody still had to make sure it got done. And if you lacked a passion piece, that still might have not happened. And I think that kind of non-data point also needs to be emphasized in this discussion, because other people who may want to go forth and do something similar, maybe it's a different project and they're hearing what you have to say about packaging the information in the way leadership needs to see it. And then they're going to go in and do that. You can't just package information. They got to believe that you're the person that's going to make sure that you're going to execute on the strategy too. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's true. I guess so. You're always selling yourself, right? And I would say this, in the day-to-day conundrums that managers go through, a lot of it's mundane and it's routine, and it's things that when you're experienced, you know how to handle easily. But it's not often that you have a day where you get this type of surprise. And when there's that type of opportunity, everything is like a centimeter at a time as a manager, right? Progress. But if you're able to get something like that, you will find the resources to make sure it gets done, right? Because you know how important it is to the overall whole. So when they said that, I wasn't worried one bit about the fact that we'd figure it out, but it was a new problem that we didn't anticipate. But that's good stuff. That's good stuff when you have those.
Jason, I've got another question along the same lines. We're talking about succession planning for the staff, but what about the leadership of the department? How did you go about developing future leaders, especially now with, the younger generation is not quite as enamored with the thought of getting into the leadership in the operating room? Do you have any hints,
Sure.
tips for that as well?
Sure. Yeah. So, I don't know that I have tips for it. I know I have my own experience, and I have the way that I like to run my departments. I will tell you that even in this example, there was a large percentage of those staff that were actually managers. So there was, approximately 10 of those people I was telling you about, those 50, were going to be managers. So that's in some ways more of a challenge than hiring 50 staff members, because that there has to be a lot. I mean, you get a seasoned nurse into a management role, and it's like starting an entirely new skill set, right? And what they know and what is entirely valuable is the clinical side, but learning how to make sure that your language is crafted carefully, learning how to position and influence, those are things that I've never seen them developed in less than 2 years, right? And so getting somebody on that track has to be started early. And so the only thing that I know is identify people early, make sure that they actually want it, because nothing worse than trying to force somebody into it and they don't really have it in their heart. And find a way to get them some reps, because it's kind of like my son who started wrestling about a year ago. I just have to keep him at practice long enough to where he starts to like it. You know what I mean? So the first couple reps as a manager, you get kicked in the teeth. It's not pleasant. And I don't know, it's a nickel at a time. I'm not really sure it's $1 million program given to you a nickel at a time, but I think that somewhere along the line you get good at it. You realize that you have a value in. It's like your new patient is your staff, right? And so that's the role that you have, and it gets in your blood, but it takes a while. So how do you, and I did that by, people love projects, right? And there's plenty of projects to do. And so if there's somebody that I think really has a knack, I'll get them some time out of the rooms. I'll let them play with a project and see, what it's like to think outside what their daily routine is. And if they like it, give them something else. Or if somebody likes being in charge every once in a while, then throw them in there and see what they think. Maybe they don't want to be a manager, but maybe they get used to it. Maybe enough people tell them that they're good at it that it changes their mind. And so I'm always on the lookout.
All right, Jason. Well, this is another excellent interview, and it definitely does complement the prior discussion that we had about the use of the predictive analytics. And I think if anybody takes anything away, it really is about how to present your argument to leadership, and also how to work with, other departments that support whatever that goal is, i.e. in this case, human resources, to show them the value that you're bringing to them. And then finally at the end here, this servant leadership theme, which has come out on many of our prior podcasts, and how important that is. And you're right. You have to kind of grow into that. You have to get beyond have to take care of the day-to-day stuff and figure out how you put people in the right positions, and that they know that you're working for them. As you said, the staff is, you're a patient and kind of in this new role. So is there anything you'd add before we wrap the conversation?
Well, actually, if it's okay with you, I'd like to communicate to the listener, if they're really technical and want to know how this is done, I have a brief bullet-pointed algorithm to go through. So in case it's not nerdy enough for people yet, I thought I'd give them a few more things. How's that?
You're a great company. There's plenty of nerds here. So
all right.
Take it away.
Okay. So here's the algorithm. First, you find the staff years of service data. It's probably going to be de-identified. Get it by role and title. And then you create a scatter plot with your staff by age. Obviously going to be de-identified as well from HR. You're going to slap those on an X and a Y axis to create a zone of awareness. You're going to identify where your vulnerabilities are as according to the late parts of their careers and their ages. And then you're going to identify your hiring status situation, usually identifiable by a hiring document or something along those lines. And you're going to project your hiring, training times, and other staffing pipelines. Get that into a linear display. Once you do that, you're going to display a graphic timeline of needs versus hiring, and identifying your needs, getting those on that. And then you subtract the difference, and you have a number of gap that you can communicate to your C-suite, and you can get their attention.
And can they reach out to you?
Oh, yes, please do. And I'd be happy to help anyone with either one of these topics if something comes up. And by the way, when you do this, this is a tool you carry with you all the time. You update it all the time. And anytime anybody wants to give you some static, you just pull it right out and you tell them what the situation is, right? And so you get what you want whenever you need it.
All right. Well, excellent job on the interview, Jason. Thanks so much for coming on again.
Thank you, JP, Paul, Melanie. Have a great day.
That was Jason Goodwin, president of Innovative Cultures, and we're talking about predictive analytics. And in this continuation of a prior conversation from a previous episode with Jason, we went from just staffing in general to succession planning, which is, really putting predictive analytics to the test, because we're trying to look into the crystal ball, see the future, and then try to get leadership and human resources all wrapped up and buying into that And, there's financial implications and considerations around that. And it really just is not, if you want to talk about organizations, people saying that's just not the way we've done it before. This is absolutely the way that it's never been done before. The way that we've always done it is when the position comes open, that's when we'll fill it and not before then. And so really getting everybody together and on the same page and utilizing data, but also being charismatic about that, Paul, I think is really important. And this was a great conversation today, once again, with Jason.
Yeah, it was. And like I said during the interview, I think the best thing a manager can do is to be able to paint a picture that the COO or the CEO can take and bring it up the chain to the higher corporate folks. Because if they can do that, it'll allow them to sell it to them, because they're under constraints too. They're given a budget, and they have to be able to manage it. So in order to really bring home that point, you have to paint a picture that everybody can understand. And what Jason did there really made so much sense. I wish I had thought of it.
Yeah, Paul. And Jason gave us the algorithm and made himself available to the audience. So if there's any managers out there who want to kind of utilize this strategy to be able to be more prepared as they look at succession planning in the future, definitely reach out to Jason. That's going to do it for this week's episode. But as a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or search for First Case on your favorite podcast application. We've also got bonus content for certain episodes, but you're going to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Paul, Melanie, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.